Okay, so we are now recording, as you all would have heard. So welcome to our weekly DNS call. Firstly, as always, thank you to DNS OARC, the long-term sponsors of the call. So their support is always appreciated. Some of the OARC community are on the call, a fair number actually today, which is also good. As you're probably aware, the main topic of conversation today is going to be DNS Catalog Zones. So I'll hand over in a moment to Willem, who is leading the panel discussion. And then depending on the amount of time we have at the end, so we'll see how the conversation flows. There's a load of interesting stuff that's happened in sort of DNS and internet governance over the last week, which I'll run through briefly if time permits, and talk about some forthcoming events, etc. But as I say, we'll see how the conversation goes, because the main purpose of the call today is to have a discussion about catalog zones. So with that in mind, let me hand over to Willem initially. And Willem, perhaps if I let you introduce your panelists,
yes,
kick off the discussion, and we'll see how it goes. So thanks everyone, and should be fun.
Yeah, sure. So so DNS catalog zones, to have a panel about this is actually Aleksi's Suhonen idea, but I also think it's a great idea. I also have together with Aleksi internet draft, which needs a little support on DNSOP. So maybe we get time to do some promotion of that later. But yes, catalog zones is very interesting topic, I think. In the panel, we have 4 prominent operators that use catalog zones in a very different way. And so I will let them talk about that. But first, I will give a very quick introduction into catalog zones. So catalog zones is a standard, and it's implemented in authoritative name servers. It's implemented in Bind9, in NotDNS, in NSD, and in PowerDNS. And the authors of those name servers also are the co-authors of this RFC 9432. So catalog zones is a method for automatic DNS zone provisioning among DNS primary and secondary name servers by storing and transferring the catalog of zones to be provisioned as one or more regular DNS zones. So what does that mean exactly? It means that you have a list, or you have a zone, and within that zone is a list of zones. And that's the configuration that tells the secondaries which zones to serve. And the primary server for a catalog zone, so the DNS zone that is the list of zones is called a catalog zone. And the zones that are within the lists are called member zones. And the provisioner of the catalog zone is called the catalog producer. And also the processors of the catalog zones are called the catalog consumers. So a producer is always the primary of a catalog zone, and a consumer is always the secondary of a catalog zone. But for the member zones within the catalog, the consumer doesn't necessarily have to be the secondary. It could also be the primary, but most likely consumers that's basically most commonplace. Yeah, that consumers are secondary for the catalog zones, but not necessarily secondary for the member zones. They could have other roles like signing, intermediate signing processes, etc. I think the operators that I will introduce have some examples of that. So the catalog is distributed from producer to consumers. Consumers have configuration associated with the catalog zone, from which primaries to transfer the member zones, etc. Or, this is another possibility, there is a group property associated with the member. So it's part of the catalog zone itself that says this member zone belongs to this group, and then the consumer can be configured to have certain configuration associated with that group. But in the current RFC, in the current standard, all the configuration for the catalog consumers must be pre-configured. So this is where the new draft that we want to introduce differs, but I'll come to that later too. So yes, so we have 4 operators. There's Aleksi Suhonen from Trex, and yes, hi Aleksi. Felipe, Agnelli, Barbosa from InternetNZ. Hi Felipe. Karl Dyson from Nominet. And Klaus Darilion from nic.at and Aotearoa. And there's me. And I think some of the operators, or the first question I would like to ask the panelists is, who are you and how do you use your catalog zones? But some of the panelists, have provided a slide already. And so I think it's easiest if I put up the next slide and then ask Klaus to tell about who are you, what do you do, how do you use catalog zones in your operations?
Hello, everybody. Willem, thanks for the introduction. My name is Klaus Darilion. I'm working for nic.at, and I'm the head of operations, and I'm also mainly in charge of our DNS services for ourselves. And for our customers, we have a product for TLDs, to host TLD zones, but we also have a product for standard secondary zones for enterprises and registrars. And this is where we use catalog zones. So on the TLD side, we don't use catalog zones at the moment. It's like a more or less static configuration. Customers doesn't change that often in zones. TLDs doesn't come and go that often, so we still manage them manually with, in our case, with Puppet. But for secondary DNS, it's highly dynamically. Like we have customers with millions of zones, and of course, every second they add zones, they delete zones, and this is like, and in our product we have to differentiate like 2 interfaces. The one is from the customer to us, and then the second thing is how we internally distribute the zones to our Anycast name servers. And this is from, so there's really a big difference, because if we use it internally, we are in complete control of the producer and the consumer. So we know the software on both sides. We know that it's interoperability. We can test it ourselves, everything. And and further, we don't need any authentication. So, or like validation. Maybe you want to validate what's inside of a catalog. Maybe you don't want that somebody is giving you a catalog and puts some certain zones within the catalog you don't want to host. And so if it's internally used, we trust each other. So I trust myself, so rather good. So usually, and that's why we don't need any validation. And then it's really straightforward. You implement the producer, you implement the consumer, and basically you're done. So it's really very easy. Also, if you have like, you don't have that many certain configurations or group options. So that was the first step when we used catalog zones, to use it internally. On the second interface, it's from the customer to us. We just recently implemented the catalog zones. In that case, the customer is the catalog producer, and our Anycast DNS service is our code 0 is the catalog consumer. So, and in that case, we are a bit more concerned because usually we validate what the customer sent to us. So if somebody, especially we have, for example, we have shared systems where we have like small customers, they share a name server. If we have big customers, they have a dedicated setup. So especially in the shared setup, we would need to validate what kind of zones do we have, or the customer tries to configure. And there are no means to validate that. For example, if somebody just adds a normal zone, we validate the zone name. Maybe it already exists in our system by some other customers, and we can do proper actions. For example, we can refuse the addition or we allow it, and we can give feedback to the customer. Either in our web portal or via the REST API, we can give a proper error code. If the zone is provisioned via a catalog zone, our consumer has to decide, usually it doesn't decide if it should accept the domain or not. If it's a member, it's automatically trusted and allowed, and the name server tries to provision that member zone. But what happens if the member zone already exists in some other catalog? So there is a name clash, and we don't have proper means to signal back to the customer that there is a problem, because the zone transfer of the catalog itself was successful. So the customer would expect that everything works, but it doesn't because there is a clash. So for now, we don't allow incoming catalogs on our shared systems, but only for the bigger customers, where they have a dedicated systems, and we can be sure that there cannot be a clash of zone names. And we want to make sure that the customer really understands what catalog zones do, because most people immediately know that's great, that's powerful, I can add all my zones immediately. But most customers don't think about that they can also lose all their zones immediately. If they have a bug in their producer and they produce an empty catalog, which is still a valid catalog, even if it's empty, like within a few seconds, we would delete all the zones from our name servers, also from all our Anycast name servers. And if that would be like 1 million of zones, even if the catalog is restored in a few seconds, it takes us some time to retransfer 1 million zones from the customer to us and then to redistribute it to all our Anycast name servers. So that's why we do not blindly allow catalog zones for our customers. So we really brief them, and we only enable that feature for customers where we trust them to understand the whole topic and to understand the good things and also the dangerous things with catalog zones. And before we want to go to offer the catalog zones to a broader audience, we're looking to implement some more safeguards in our consumer software. So even if an empty catalog is by the RFC, it's a valid catalog, we want to implement some safeguards, for example, that the customer can configure. If there are less than 1,000 zones in the catalog, then it's probably a problem on my side and don't trust the catalog. So of course, we have to implement that in the name server software. And I also started a discussion in the DNS ORC community. Like some people like that idea, some people don't like it. They say it's the customer's choice. If they produce a broken catalog, a valid empty catalog, it's their fault. But in our case, we always have we try to make our DNS service fail-safe. Because if the customer would be really advanced in DNS, he probably would do the DNS hosting itself. So most of our customers, they are not that experts in the DNS. They are more like experts in the domain and in the web hosting zones, and they want to trust us to do all the DNS for them. So that's why we have implemented plenty of safeguards, which are actually not our which should actually the customer should do it, but we do it for the customers. Actually, he pays us for that. So we implement more validation and safeguards that's like mentioned in the RFC. But it's like better safe than sorry. So we are not wanting to push the catalog zones to the customers to a broader audience before we have implemented additional safeguards. So
Yes.
that was from my side.
Yes. Thank you, Klaus. So I do have a few questions myself. Also did see Aleksi raising your hand.
Oh, yes. I just wanted to ask that when you are consuming the customer's catalog, are you first pulling the zones into some sort of a distribution server and then pushing from there on to the Anycast cloud? Or
Yes, so the internal distribution is totally independent from how the zone gets from the customer to us. So it's not that we reuse that catalog to send it to the Anycast instances. We use, like in our case, we have database replication to all our Anycast sites. And on certain Anycast sites, depending on the customer features we have enabled, we use it internally we have like say it the other round, we have different name server software. You know, there's Power DNS, which is great with database backends, but it's not the fastest name server out there, but it's the most flexible one. And there is, for example, Knot, which is like and if you compare them, like the Power DNS is the Volkswagen. If it's broken, you stop it, you start it, and you can drive again within a few seconds, and everything works fine. And it's immediately flexible. You can do everything with it. And if you use Knot, it's like a dragster. It takes some time to get it to the start line. Once it starts, it's immediately fast. But if there's a problem, you have to stop it. You have to go back. So, and restarting a Knot process with 1 million zones, it takes like a few minutes. So it's like much more difficult to handle. And depending on the requirements for our customers, we still use Power DNS and DNS dist setup, or we use a Knot-based setup. And at some point, we have to move all the zones from Power DNS to Knot. And there we use the catalog zones internally. So, but this is really independent on how the zones get in from the customer to our side. So even if the customer has like 10 catalogs and to our distribution name servers, we only have one database replication to the Anycast sites, and if needed, like one catalog from Power DNS to Knot with all the zones. So it's totally separated.
Another thing I wanted to say was that I think it was on this DNS weekly call a week or two ago, someone said about DNSSEC that it's a sharp tool. It's very nice, but you can really hurt yourself with it. And I guess from Klaus's bit, we can also deduce that catalog zones can also be a very sharp tool.
Yeah, that's a good comparison.
Yeah.
So at the moment, we only have like the big sharp knife. And before we sell it to more customers, we want to protect a little bit and make like, there are the knives for the kids, which are not that sharp and a little bit round in the front. So that we have to do first.
Yes, I think it's very, very interesting that you're offering to be a catalog consumer for customers who are the producers. That's quite unique, I think. But I have a question about that. So you have signaling of conflicts. For example, a customer adds a zone as member zone, but it's also already in another catalog. Do you think there are protocol improvements can be made to support those kind of scenarios? I assume you now fix it all within your own ecosystem, but do you think there could be something more generic to help out with that?
I haven't thought about it, honestly, because I think in our case, if we detect like a problem, a little bit later when the zone transfer of the catalog was already finished, and actually it's too late to signal any errors back. Like if we detect some problems, we have a message queue on our API, so where we can put messages and notification to the customers. So that would be like, in our case, the better approach, because it would actually work out of the box. And in the long term, I think to send like, I think somebody had the idea that the consumer can send like a notify or whatever kind of DNS message back to the consumer to signal the like encode the error somehow. I think yeah, that sounds funny, but I don't think it's like that it will be implemented that fast. So, and I
Yeah.
think it's like, of course, you could like, if there's an incoming zone transfer of the catalog, you could like, if you before you finish the zone transfer, maybe you have to. No, I think it's not possible because if I request a zone transfer, I cannot send back an error code during, like only the other side can signal an error. So I
Yeah.
don't think that this can be solved easily in the DNS protocol.
Yeah,
Okay,
my idea is that because all zones automatically have some sort of a host master email address, including the catalog zone, I suppose it's out of band, but the errors could be sent as email to the address in the start of authority record, SOA record, in the catalog zone.
yeah.
At that time, I wonder how many email addresses in the SOA record actually works.
I mean, if the catalog producer doesn't want those error codes or error messages, then he can just put a dot in there or whatever. But if he does want the errors, he'll make sure that the email address works.
Yeah.
Would be an option, yes.
Yep. So I have another quick question. Was implementing to be a consumer for customer catalog producers, was that by customer request, or did you just offer this as a service?
We heard it a few times as a request,
Okay.
and then we said, oh, we don't have it, but we have like here we have a REST API, and here's a bash script, a 5-line bash script to add all your zones automatically. Oh no, we don't need catalog in that case. So saying most customers were asking about catalog because they were afraid that it's really a lot of work for the onboarding of thousands of zones. But actually, if you script it, it's not difficult anyways. And so we had a long time where we said, oh, we don't need that feature, no need to implement it. But it was like a little bit of my personal interest to play around with, is because we used it internally. And I said, actually, it's not that much effort to implement it also on the customer side. And we had one customer where we said, okay, we were confident that they know how it works, they know how dangerous it could be. And so we, like it was our first friendly customer, and so we implement it for these customers. And it was like a half day on the API side and on the name server side. And then it was like, a few days to implement it in the web interface, because in the web interface, there are certain features for a member zone you don't want to allow. Usually you can, like, in our case, we can switch a secondary zone to a primary zone or the other way around, and lots of features that doesn't make sense for a member zone. And that was the reason why in the web interface, it was much more work to integrate the catalog zones.
Okay. Thank you. So I guess we need to move to the next slide and let our next operator, Karl Dyson, introduce himself and his use of catalog zones in Nominet.
Hello, folks. So I'm Karl Dyson. I'm enterprise architect at Nominet with focus on all of our DNSSEC systems. So in our use case, we're always the producer, and we are with one exception, always the consumer. So we don't have some of the concerns necessarily that Klaus just outlined in his use case, but we do still have the considerations around things like the controls and protections around not accidentally producing an empty catalog and watching zones disappear from edge networks, for example. So I said there was an exception. So one of our customers, they're on we have what we refer to as stacks, which I'll get onto it on the next point. But this customer has a dedicated stack of equipment, and so the catalog is dedicated to them. They also consume a copy of their zones back from us, so they manage them in either via an API or a portal. But they then get a copy of the catalog, so that when they add a zone in the portal, they get the catalog gets updated, and the secondary servers on their side then effectively maintain a full catalog of all of the member zones as well. That's useful in their use case because we run not only the internet facing zones, we also run an internal facing recursive resolver and a whole set of and obviously an internal authoritative horizon as well. So then we have we distribute. We use catalog zones to distribute through the stack and onto our edge. So our stacks typically look like an unsigned primary, which is either receiving zone updates from a DNS portal that the customer can use, or in the case of registry zones, those changes are coming from the registry systems. The zone then makes its way to a signer, onto a distribution server, and then out onto the edge platform. For one of our customers, we also, where we run an internal horizon for their authoritative setup, and we also run their recursive setup. Or not all of their zones are in one apex, and so when they add a new zone to the internal horizon, the recursive server needs to know that it's there, and so it needs a forward added to its configuration. So we run a sidecar process, and we run within the ext part of catalog zones. We encode forwarding details. Such that then this sidecar process looks at that catalog. If it gets updated, it then has an ability to determine that, right, the config for the recursive server needs to be updated, generates a new config, and pokes the recursor to pick up that config as part of then that zone also getting added to the authoritative side. One of the things that we have spotted that for our use case would be very useful to add is that we would like to be able to say to an inline signer that's doing bump inline signing of zones, hey, you're not just a consumer of the catalog. When you onboard a new zone that gets added to the catalog, we want you to also, set up a bunch of keys, start signing with this policy, and to that end, I've written a draft which I'm keen to collaborate with folks on, that outlines how you might do that in a standardized way. So catalog zones, as Willem outlined earlier, has a group function, but our feeling is that it would be nice for that functionality to be implemented in a way that's sort of independent of the implementation and standardizable. So, if at some point in the future I want to change my signing software, I can go, right, okay, well it adheres to this RFC. I know I can change and use this other software and sort of minimize my risk there. Yeah, that's probably about it from me. Any questions?
Are there any
No.
questions?
Up in the chat.
I'm
Up
just
in the
scrolling.
chat.
They're just scrolling.
Okay, Vicky.
Yeah, so each stack is would be a different catalog. So we haven't implemented catalog zones in all of our stacks yet. It's something we're gradually rolling out. But yeah, effectively, we use different stacks for different what you might call different customer groupings, depending on our ability to keep them separate from one another. So obviously, we're most well known for running .uk, but we also run something in the order of about 85 other TLDs, GTLDs mostly. And so we have a number of different stacks that are used for provisioning different groups of zones. And then we have customers where we run a recursive and internal horizon, for example, as well. So some of those, we keep separate from one another.
Yeah. I was intrigued that you also configure recursors with based on catalog zones, because it sort of reminds me that we also have a recursor at NLnet Labs, and it can be configured by a list of zones, but those are called response policy zones, which is a special kind of configuration, I guess. It's mostly filtering, but yeah, it's interesting to that. So the catalog zone is perhaps a more generic tool.
So in that case, I don't want to throw him under the bus, but I think I see my colleague David Groves on the call. So he's actually the engineering manager who's developed and implemented this. I don't think I'm telling anybody any state secrets by stating that the recursive server in this particular use case is yours.
Okay, yeah.
Found by NLnet Labs. So
that is indeed accurate. There was a problem with the forwarders and stuff, but yeah, I can do that for another day.
Okay. So Vicky is mentioning, in addition to RPZ zones, I think the CATS approach should be useful for distributing and updating ACLs as well. I agree. I think so too.
That was sort of a random, cheapo comment, but if I might ask my other question, so and this maybe doesn't apply as much to Nominet as to some of the other presenters, but I'm curious if you guys are having, there's any significant performance pressure on how long after a customer sends you either a new zone or a zone update you have until it's supposed to be published, and if it's faster or slower using catalog zones. I haven't any idea.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, from a Nominet point of view, considerations around being able to quickly provision a zone for one particular customer did come up, and catalog zones means that they can add a zone in the portal or via the API, and it appears on the infrastructure within how long does DNS take to propagate, kind of seconds.
Right. Well, of course, if you have to put a secondary process to start checking the catalog zones, that would, of course, complicate that. But
yeah, great.
On the other hand, the catalog zone update triggers a notify, which will go through the chain. So it would sort of be directly DNS daemon to DNS daemon signaling instead of going through backends.
Yeah.
I thought I saw Klaus raising his hand halfway through that as well.
So in our case, for our secondary zones product, it doesn't really make a difference, because if we get the request to add a zone via the API, we provision it on the Power DNS. If there's an incoming zone transfer of the catalog zone, which which adds a new member zone, it would automatically be more or less the same insert in the database and then triggers the same action. So it doesn't like, I would say in the normal case, it wouldn't introduce or any additional delay or make any improvement. Of course, there can be like conditions if you have like a big catalog with 1 million of zones. And at the moment, PowerDNS is famous for incremental zone it's infamous for incremental zone transfers. So if you use a full zone transfer for the 1 million member catalog zones, of course, it would take more time. So I think in that case, with PowerDNS and always a full zone transfer, it's not very comfortable to have catalog zones for 1 million zones. It works nice for like 100 member zones, and if there is not, or maybe thousands, but if we go to the millions, then we would first have to fix proper incremental zone transfer in PowerDNS to can benefit to use it also for the catalog zones.
All right. So I will forward to the next slide and give the David.
Yes,
David.
just a quick question. I am unfamiliar and woefully ignorant of what was meant by PowerDNS is infamous for its incremental zone transfers. What is that about?
In the DNS, you have two types of option for a zone transfer. Either a full zone transfer, which is called AXFR, or it's an IXFR, which is an incremental zone transfer. With an incremental zone transfer, you don't transfer the whole zone, but only the changes of the zone. Like you are doing programming.
I'm familiar with those. What's special about PowerDNS with regard to IXFR, though?
If you take, there are a list of events in the history where there could be introduced inconsistencies because the increment was not properly applied in certain race conditions. Those are, I guess, fixed meanwhile. So there are still problems with DNS-sake zones because in a zone you can have a so-called empty non-terminal record. And if you do a zone transfer, and if you do an update to its zone which removes the terminal record, the incremental zone transfer doesn't delete the empty non-terminal record, so it's still in the database and it would cause problems. It can cause problems, especially if the zone is signed. If it's an unsigned zone, it shouldn't cause any problems, but with signed zones, it can cause problems because in the DNS calculations and algorithm, PowerDNS would still use the empty non-terminal, although it shouldn't be there anymore. So it's I think nobody will notice it in a normal way, but there's still theoretically a chance that the zone gets inconsistent if you use incremental zone transfers with PowerDNS.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, maybe this is already fixed. I don't know if there's someone from PowerDNS here, but well, so I just want to quickly add that when writing RC 9432, we also still had, when it was still a draft, a serial property that would that could be configured next to the catalog member, so that the secondaries didn't need to listen for notifies anymore because they could immediately see from the updated serial that there's a new zone. And especially for large number of zones, this could be minimize the amount of SOA queries and notifies. Yeah. That said, I would like to go to our next operator, which is Felipe Barbosa from InternetNZ. Felipe, can you introduce yourself and talk a bit about your operations and how you use catalog zones?
Sure. I'm Felipe. I work at InternetNZ as a DNS specialist. My idea with this slide, with my contribution to this presentation, it's just explore and show a perspective in an early stage that we don't have implemented correctly yet, catalog zones in our environment. But we have some projects that fit for this condition because we see value in using this. So I just would like to explore this perspective and show our environments and how this could be a good fit, right? And our cautions with safeguards. So our idea to use this should be as producer and consumer. We are deal internally with our public face zones. And though to our environment, we don't have a flat zone. Our zones are hierarchical, so we have 16 different zones. And we need control every zone in a different way. We have different policy. We have all independent management for the zones. We have today an Ansible orchestration that could be a good replacement for a DNS native solution. So we can remove all this complexity using the catalog zones for the solution. Remove this complexity. In a multi-sign environment, you have many different kinds of environments to test. So you have QA, stage, UT, and prod. And you have two different kind of prod. We have different sites that we do signer site suite. So I'm just saying this because we saw value in catalog zones to remove all this complexity to manage zones in that way because of our multi-signer architecture. And also, beside of this, we have multiple source of truth. It means that you have a database with different kind of servers generate zones that feed our first step of unsigned zones. And why this is relevant to us now? Because now we are working in two different projects. Every project in a different situation, in a different step. So we have a signing pipeline that we're moving, I would say, a monolithic way to deal DNS in our signing infrastructure to a CI/CD oriented approach. So we are deal with a different kind of challenge that we are trying to modernize our infrastructure. So everything, again, that remove complexity and have safeguards for us to deal with our situation, we are adopting or at least testing now in our stage. So we have the timing correctly to do this and the needs. Another project that you are dealing, it's more an early stage, is the NCAS refreshment that we are doing. We need to replace all the way that you do NCAS with a new modern way. And this can be also used for this project, for this situation. So I can just raise warnings for our setup that we need to deal with multiple source, multiple primaries. We need to deal with automatically manage each different kind of zone with different kind of ACL, T6, this requirements per zone. So probably some other colleagues here that already deploy deal with situation in a different way, but it will be good to have this in RFC and some pattern in a DNS software. So it's more or less what I'd like to share this. So I believe that's me.
Okay, thank you. So, Aleksi, would you tell something about yourself and your operations? I could put on the filtering and processing slide.
Sure. So if I'll start with myself, the previous speakers have been basically operators of top-level domains who either operate Anycast fleets for themselves or in some cases for others as well. I work for Trex, which is an internet exchange point. So we don't have an Anycast service of our own, but we host a lot of these nodes for others, like, well, we host one of nic.at's services, rcode0. We host the packet clearinghouse AS42 Anycast DNS service. We host community DNS, and so on. As an exchange point, we have like 10 or a dozen zones. We don't have a lot of zones, but I've still added those into the a catalog, and to familiarize myself initially with the technology. So I use it between my own primary and my own secondary. We don't use it. So one of the benefits of running an exchange point that hosts a lot of these Anycast services is that we usually get a deal with each of these Anycast services that we can get our 10 zones on their service. So if you look at Trex.fi, for example, you'll see that it has a lot of different Anycast services, NS records. So far, we don't use catalog zones toward any of those, but at some point, when the technology matures, we'll probably try to move to that direction. But while I've been working on this and also working with Willem on the new draft that we've been writing, I've run into, well, mainly security issues, but also other usability issues. So if I look at, for example, Klaus's process, where he receives, consumes a catalog from a customer, and then directs it to the Anycast fleet, or maybe through some different stages in between. He currently has to basically take the catalog zone from DNS into his own software to process it further, and then output another catalog zone to give the DNS servers. So I've been trying to figure a way to keep it all in DNS. So I've been trying to figure out a way to process, automate the processing of catalog zones. For example, in Klaus's case, when a customer catalog zone is consumed, it might have primary name server addresses belonging to the customer, but the Anycast fleet can't contact those servers directly. They will only contact the distribution server. So one simple processing instruction would be to replace any name servers in the catalog zone with the distribution server. And then one of the security issues that I've discovered is that if the customer can put any name servers into their catalog zone, then so the basic catalog zone RFC doesn't support this, but Bind, for example, has an extension that does support it, and our new draft is also trying to canalize that sort of extension to be standard. But if that feature exists, then the producer of the catalog, so the customer, can put a malicious IP address as a DNS server, malicious in one way or another, and then the consumer, if the consumer blindly trusts it, then they might end up doing something undesirable. So it would be good to be able to automate also the filtering of what is in the catalog zone. And then the third bullet, combining multiple catalog zones, is that if the distribution server is consuming lots of customer catalogs and then pushing them further into the stages of the production, then it would be nice to be able to combine several catalog zones into one catalog zone. But then you have to, that it's not as simple as it sounds. So RFC 2136, which defines the DNS update mechanism. It also provides a lot of rules for manipulating zones so that the end result is safe, that it's, for example, it doesn't have two SOA records, or it doesn't have C names, two C names on the same name, or anything other that is illegal. And tools like NSUpdate, which implement this RFC, also provide basis for a syntax that could be used to, if expanded a little, could be used to automate this processing of catalog zones and filtering of catalog zones. But we are running out of time, so I think I'll stop it there.
Yes, I think so too. So I can quickly say that we indeed, as you already mentioned, Aleksi, we do have a internet draft. Remember that currently catalog zones is just the list of member zones and nothing else. All the catalog consumers must be pre-configured to do something with the catalog. So what we are introducing now is something that Bind indeed already has, is to have properties that make exceptions for certain configuration. And we could use a little support for this draft on DNS Hub, because, you know, if here's an example of what it looks like. For example, there could be a property saying the primary for this member zone is this server and not the default for this catalog zone or the default for the group. So yeah, that's it, I guess. And I think it was interesting. Are there any more questions? If not,
not a question really, just a comment.
yes.
I think with catalog zones we are just at the beginning, as we talked about, like the group properties and all the extensions that could be done, like with the signal of the serial of the zone, or like recently in PowerDNS there was a patch to like they called it one zone to rule them all. So they implement a recursive catalog. So that means that you can make a member of a catalog zone can be a new catalog itself, and you could do that recursively.
Yeah.
So probably because somebody wanted that feature. So I think the people are innovative what they now could do with the catalog zones. They have ideas how they could like use it in their company or to get rid of old legacy stuff and improve their setups. So I think in the next years we will see plenty of like maybe nice or crazy ideas how catalog zones could be used in real life.
I hope so. And I think it's great you are pioneering this field.
Fantastic. Well, that feels like a good moment to just move on then on that positive forward-looking comment. I'm just mindful of the time. So Alison, if you've got a question, pop it in the chat and see if one of the guys can respond just while I wrap up. But sorry, let me just very briefly share my slides back again and say, well, firstly, thank you, Aleksi, for the idea of the conversation, Willem for sort of steering the catalog ship, to mix metaphors, and Felipe, Karl, and Klaus, thank you also for your sort of thoughts. I think it will sort of stimulate some ongoing discussion. Let me very briefly, and this will be brief, I will finish on the hour, call out a couple of things from our sort of weekly sort of news headlines. So if any of you are new to the call, don't get these let me have a just drop me an email and I'll happily add you to the mailing list. But a couple of things I wanted to share out. So to highlight, firstly, the next round of the Nominet DNS fund has been announced with additional funding and more flexibility in the awards. I'm going to try and get one of the Nominet team on this call to just talk about it a bit, but you can see the sort of key points on the slide in front of you. Also, there's a call for contributions for OARC 47. The meeting takes place in early November in Vancouver and remotely. So the program committee have put out a call for contributions. You've got until 4th of August to put forward any proposals. Maybe there should be something on catalog zones, maybe to continue this discussion, just as a thought. Lots of other things, but we really don't have time. Interesting piece in the last APNIC podcast on what name-based routing means. But I'll leave you to look at that. And a call for participation for ICANN have got a new law enforcement authentication input group providing expert inputs to their proposal around RDRS. And how requests for information can be processed or authenticated from law enforcement agencies, and they're asking for input from across the whole ecosystem, so not just law enforcement people. So I'm sure there's some people on this call in registries, registrars, etc., that may well have some thoughts to share. Yeah, and just for fun, since DNS abuse was a key theme of the last ICANN policy forum, interesting piece about how AI is making that problem harder to detect. Some of you were on the call last week when I sort of shared my thoughts on the meeting. I did say I thought that the ICANN community was being over-optimistic, and clearly Garv Chauhan from India's National Forensic Sciences University shares my take on that. But there's loads of other things, a really bumper week, but we won't have time to cover them all. Lots of other unrelated to sort of DNS and internet governance stuff as well. Again, we really don't have time to cover all of that, other than if you use Signal, Russian hackers apparently are now targeting your Signal backup recovery keys. So bear that in mind. And also agentic AI penetration testing was a key theme in the last RSAC event. And some thoughts now, maybe it's not as effective as perhaps was first thought. Just to be depressing. Lots of calls for papers, key ones really. If you're planning to present at the next APNIC meeting, you've got until tomorrow to put your papers in. And if you're planning to go to Vienna for the next ITF meeting, or indeed attend remotely, the early rate expires next Monday. So not the super early rate, but the early rate. Otherwise, the registration fee bumps up by a couple of $100 for in-person attendance after that. Other than that, as I say, plenty of other stuff. I'll show the slides afterwards, as we don't have time. Lots of events coming up. Tomorrow there's an interim ITF dispatch meeting, and also next week AI for Good is taking place in Geneva. I haven't finalised the topic for our call next week, but I'll see if I can find one of the Nominet team able to perhaps come on and talk about the DNS fund, as that has got a relatively short application window. But don't be surprised if that's the topic. But I just need to firm up on a speaker first. But with that in mind, as we are slightly over the hour, so apologies for overrunning slightly, but I think that was an interesting set of discussions. So thank you again to the team for doing that, and for Aleksi for the idea. We won't have time for anything else that's on people's minds, but have a fantastic week, and look forward to continuing the discussion online potentially, including on Mattermost, those of you who are part of the OARC community. But thanks everyone, have a great week. See you all next Monday.
I'll find somebody, Andrew.
Perfect.
It might even be me, but I will have a chat. I'll try and bring Amy or somebody to the call next week.
Brilliant. All right. Appreciate that. Thanks, Karl.
No worries.
Bye.
See ya.